Welcome to the lecture from Mega Sci experts.
Look, for those of us in the clinical and research trenches, the MDs, the PhDs, the biogerontologists, we know the longevity space is absolutely flooded with consumer hype right now. So today, we're cutting straight through that noise to decode the actual, verified clinical pathophysiology of human aging. Because once you strip away the marketing, the signal hidden in the data is genuinely fascinating. Here is our clinical roadmap for today's discussion. First, the longevity reality. Second, metabolic signaling and genetics. Third, epigenetic entropy. Fourth, neurovascular pathology. Fifth, biological inflection points. And finally, number 6, the unified matrix. Let's dive right into section 1, the longevity reality. Right off the bat, there's this stark, massive disconnect between high-profile experimental hype and the rather unglamorous reality of proactive clinical management. You've got the billionaire myth chasing preclinical concepts, things like cellular reprogramming or parabasis. And we all saw those recent FDA warnings citing severe cardiovascular and immune risks associated with parabasis. Meanwhile, actual scientific reality relies on something far more robust: continuous biometric tracking, highly precise glycemic control, personalized nutrition, and rapid specialist intervention.
To really put that into perspective, let's look at the demographic outcomes of those practical interventions. Extreme wealth yields a massive 14.5-year life expectancy gap for men and a 10.9-year gap for women. That is a huge advantage. But a closer look at the data reveals there is actually no verified biological age reversal happening there. That astonishing gap comes entirely from elite mortality risk management and highly capitalized, optimized metabolic oversight. It's management, not magic.
Moving on to section 2, metabolic signaling and genetics. You know as well as I do that genetic variants account for only a surprisingly small fraction of average lifespan variants. Even in early-onset Alzheimer's cases driven by presenilin mutations, we only see a 3% full genetic penetrance. For the vast majority of human lifespan, the old clinical adage holds absolutely true. Genetics load the gun, but epigenetics and metabolic environments pull the trigger. It's only when we analyze the centenarian spike, those rare individuals surviving past 90 or 100 years, that we suddenly see a sharp, nonlinear dependency on protective genetic variants.
One of the most important protective pathways involves FOXO3. Here's how the mechanism plays out. When insulin or IGF-1 signaling is active, an AKT kinase cascade actually traps FOXO3 in the cytoplasm, which renders it totally inactive. But under dietary restriction, that signaling is inhibited. FOXO3 remains unphosphorylated, which allows it to successfully localize into the nucleus, where it aggressively upregulates target genes that drive cellular autophagy, stress resistance, and critical DNA repair. So longevity via FOXO3 is literally just a state of engineered metabolic scarcity.
All right, section 3, epigenetic entropy.
In our field, we constantly have to navigate the pitfall of clock discordance. Reversing a biological age methylation clock in an in vitro assay absolutely does not equal physiological organ rejuvenation in a human patient. It's a critical distinction. A downward trend on a single biomarker line is biologically meaningless if it isn't backed by functional preservation. Because true aging isn't just a number on a test, it's the systemic, chaotic loss of epigenetic fidelity over time. To truly visualize this loss of fidelity, single-cell sequencing is incredibly revealing. Think about a young cell. It maintains high-density, beautifully ordered CpG island methylation. That means precise transcriptional boundaries and strict functional identity. But look at an older cell suffering from stochastic entropy. Those ordered patterns completely degrade into massive, dispersed variants. Neighboring cells in the exact same tissue actually begin expressing entirely different chromatin accessibility. They literally lose their functional identity.
Let's bring this to section 4, neurovascular pathology.
Applying this understanding of cellular entropy directly to the brain leads us to neuropathology, and specifically the ancestral APOE4 allele. Evolutionarily speaking, APOE4 predates the newer human adaptation of APOE3. Clinically, APOE4 homozygosity increases Alzheimer's risk roughly 12-fold. Mechanistically, it severely impairs CNS lipid transport and essentially blocks the clearance of amyloid beta. Past age 60, this diffuse aggregation condenses into highly dense formations, resulting in severe neuroglial inflammation and fatal synaptic destruction.
So, how do we target this therapeutically without causing secondary damage?
Well, systemic suppression of ApoE fails completely. It triggers severe hypercholesterolemia because the liver desperately relies on it for systemic lipid transport. However, targeted siRNA engineered to bypass the liver can successfully degrade ApoE mRNA exclusively within the central nervous system. But we also have to protect the blood-brain barrier itself. High-fat and high-sugar metabolic spikes severely compromise endothelial nitric oxide synthesis, reducing vasodilation and directly threatening the astrocyte-tight junctions that keep inflammatory cytokines out.
All of this begs a highly mechanical biogerontological question. Given this inevitable daily accumulation of neuroglial inflammation and metabolic byproducts, how does our neural architecture mechanically manage and clear this localized pathology?
The answer is incredibly elegant. It's the glymphatic system. During stage 3 deep sleep, the brain essentially acts as its own janitor. Glial cells physically shrink down, which widens the intercellular spaces by an astonishing 60%. This massive structural shift allows cerebrospinal fluid to rapidly flush accumulated amyloid beta and tau proteins from the interstitial spaces directly into the lymphatic system. This is exactly why fragmented sleep or sleep apnea is so devastating. Failing to reach stage 3 deep sleep fundamentally blocks the brain's primary non-pharmacological mechanism for halting amyloidogenic pathways.
Now, even with perfect glymphatic clearance, some neuronal loss over a lifetime is inevitable. Therefore, true neurological longevity is really about outpacing that pathological decline through synaptogenesis, building up a massive cognitive reserve. Triggered by BDNF via consistent exercise and complex mental challenges, the brain can create up to 30,000 synaptic connections per single neuron. This incredibly dense integration creates such robust functional redundancies that it can essentially mask the clinical symptoms of physical brain pathology.
Section 5. Biological inflection points.
Biological aging is absolutely not a smooth, linear progression. Instead, the data shows it's punctuated by rapid, sudden proteomic shifts. The chronological nodes where biological aging suddenly decelerates are incredibly specific: age 34, age 44, age 60, and age 78.
For those of us looking at early clinical intervention, the age 44 inflection is arguably the most critical. At this specific node, we observe sharp coordinated declines across multiple physiological systems. We see a steep drop in liver detoxification efficiency, significant reductions in systemic insulin sensitivity, and a plummeting of endothelial nitric oxide production. The clinical translation here is crystal clear. Proven lifestyle interventions and biomarker tracking have to aggressively ramp up before these deceleration curves hit, not after the damage has already begun to compound.
Finally, Section 6, the unified matrix.
To synthesize all of this, we have to look at how deeply interconnected these systems truly are. Metabolic control, specifically via glycemic management, optimizes that crucial FOXO3 signaling we discussed. That metabolic stability then supports epigenetic fidelity, holding off stochastic entropy. And maintaining that precise cellular identity preserves our complex neurological architecture, keeping the blood-brain barrier intact for effective amyloid clearance during deep sleep. A failure in just one of these systems literally accelerates pathology across the rest.
Ultimately, true longevity escapes the noise of billionaire hype. It requires rigorously managing epigenetic entropy, optimizing FOXO3 signaling, and leveraging proven clinical therapeutics. But knowing that biological aging isn't a slow fade and is instead punctuated by sudden coordinated chronological inflections leaves us with one incredibly critical question to ponder. Since we now have the data on exactly when these biological cascades trigger, at which chronological node are you going to intervene first?
As clinicians, neurophysiologists, and biogerontologists, I know you are acutely aware of the sheer volume of noise surrounding Silicon Valley's quest for eternal youth. It's everywhere, right? But today, we're cutting through the sensationalism. We are going to conduct a rigorous, objective clinical review of the longevity therapeutics currently backed by extreme wealth, and we're going to contrast those highly experimental models with the actual epidemiological reality of human health span extension.
Here is our clinical roadmap for this review. We'll start by defining therapeutics, look at the wealth longevity gap, map out the clinical pipeline, analyze off-label interventions, discuss unproven biologics, and finally, deliver our clinical verdict.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, defining anti-aging therapeutics and setting our clinical baseline.
To start, we have to establish some strict boundary conditions. We all know that aesthetic improvements, like exogenous androgens or surgical interventions, absolutely do not equate to a systemic deceleration of biological aging. Plus, reversing an epigenetic clock or shifting a single surrogate biomarker, that simply doesn't prove you're mitigating sarcopenia, cardiovascular decline, or neurodegeneration. For a genuine anti-aging therapeutic to earn its name, it has to meet a massive burden of proof. We're talking about preserving physiological function, definitively delaying the onset of pleiotropic age-related pathologies, or extending all-cause survival in controlled, in vivo human studies.
Moving on to Section 2, the wealth longevity gap. Let's look at the epidemiological data to see what extreme wealth is actually buying today.
I want you to look at this delta, 14.5. When you dig into extensive longitudinal cohort data, like the Chetty studies published in JAMA, a really stark life expectancy gap emerges between the top and bottom income percentiles. We're looking at a survival advantage of 14.5 years for men and 10 years for women. It's a profound epidemiological variance. But here's the crucial takeaway. This advantage isn't being driven by secret proprietary biologics. It is heavily correlated with socioeconomic determinants and highly optimized medical access.
So, how exactly is that 14.5-year gap operationalized in the real world? Well, it's essentially the unhindered optimization of conventional medicine. Extreme wealth buys you a dedicated, multidisciplinary clinical team. It enables rapid specialist access, incredibly advanced prophylactic cardiovascular diagnostics, regular DEXA scans, continuous glucose monitoring, and aggressive polypharmacy optimization. Now, none of this reverses the fundamental hallmarks of aging at a cellular level, but it is highly efficacious at identifying pathophysiological deviations incredibly early and keeping chronic comorbidities under tight therapeutic control.
Now let's transition to Section 3, where we'll examine the cellular rejuvenation clinical pipeline. When we map the massive capital influx against actual clinical reality, a pretty stark dichotomy emerges. Take Altos Labs, backed by Jeff Bezos. They launched with roughly $3 billion, targeting cellular rejuvenation, primarily focusing on partial epigenetic reprogramming using Yamanaka factors. Then you have Sam Altman backing Retro Biosciences with $180 million to target cellular drivers of aging. But let's look at their current clinical status. Altos is entirely preclinical. Retro does have one small molecule in early human trials for Alzheimer's, but their actual reprogramming arms are still strictly in vitro or murine. The reality is, massive capitalization just doesn't bypass the translation gap. These are very early-stage discovery pipelines, not market-ready therapeutics.
Now, when human translation does finally occur in this space, it is extremely targeted. For instance, in 2026, Life Biosciences announced the first participant dosed with ER100, which is an experimental gene therapy utilizing partial reprogramming. But pay close attention to the indication. It's being delivered via intravitreal injection specifically for optic nerve disease, likely targeting Nion. This Phase 1 trial is assessing localized safety and tolerability right in the eye. It is decidedly not a systemic, whole-body longevity intervention. As you can see, the actual science is methodical and localized, far from a systemic panacea.
Okay, let's move into Section 4 and critically analyze off-label interventions.
Here, we run headfirst into the classic translation gap in biogerontology, using rapamycin as our primary case study. As you know, rapamycin is an FDA-approved mTOR inhibitor with genuinely robust preclinical data showing lifespan extension across multiple murine models. Yet the human clinical reality has been sobering. Take the PEARL trial, which evaluated 114 older adults on intermittent low-dose rapamycin. The primary endpoint of visceral fat reduction, it was completely missed. Furthermore, a recent trial combining weekly rapamycin with exercise in older adults actually failed to augment hypertrophic or functional outcomes, with some data even leaning toward the placebo group. Metformin, a widely tested AMPK activator, shares a very similar narrative. Fantastic preclinical data, but highly inconclusive evidence for reducing all-cause mortality in metabolically healthy humans.
This brings us to Section 5, Unproven Biologics and the FDA's Definitive Stance.
I am sure you are all well aware of the intense media fixation on heterochronic parabiosis and systemic circulating factors, specifically those pervasive rumors surrounding Peter Thiel and young donor plasma. Well, while Thiel's certainly expressed interest in the underlying science at one point, he actually confirmed he never underwent the treatment. Yet online speculation somehow fabricated entire dosing schedules for a protocol that didn't even exist. This perfectly illustrates why we need regulatory deference. In 2024, the FDA issued a highly definitive safety communication stating unequivocally that young donor plasma is not approved for aging or cognitive decline, there is zero robust evidence of clinical benefit, and frankly, it carries significant risks of transfusion-associated complications.
Let's wrap this up in Section 6 with our evidence-based clinical verdict.
As medical and research professionals, it's absolutely crucial we critically appraise these novel therapeutic claims. I recommend using the strict three-step triad. First, was the efficacy actually demonstrated in randomized, placebo-controlled human trials, or is it just confined to in vitro assays in mouse models? Second, did the intervention shift a hard clinical endpoint, like delaying morbidity, improving functional capacity, or extending all-cause survival, or did it merely alter a surrogate biomarker? And finally, is the agent being administered for an FDA-approved indication or within a strictly IRB-monitored trial, rather than just as some uncontrolled off-label experiment?
Look, while billions in capital flowed toward the distant promise of epigenetic reprogramming, the absolute most reliable, evidence-based interventions for maximizing human health span today remain remarkably conventional. The data unequivocally supports the aggressive management of hypertension, ApoB reduction, and tight glycemic control. It heavily supports VO2 max optimization, resistance training for sarcopenia prevention, smoking cessation, and strict adherence to standard oncological screenings and vaccination schedules. Does this protocol lack the sci-fi allure of proprietary gene therapy? Sure, but it actually possesses the definitive, peer-reviewed clinical data to back it up.
Which leaves us with a final, rather pressing clinical consideration. We know from history that private off-label experimentation is not synonymous with therapeutic efficacy. Often, early adopters of experimental biologics serve merely to uncover adverse, downstream side effects. So, as these billion-dollar preclinical pipelines inevitably face the immense friction of human translation, we really have to ask ourselves, will the relentless media and capital focus on cellular reprogramming distract the broader medical community from aggressively deploying the tools we already possess to close that 14-year epidemiological survival gap? It's a vital question for the future of biogerontology. Thank you for joining this explainer. Let's keep pushing the boundaries of true evidence-based medicine.
Thank you for being with us. Megasci is for you and for us. Thank you for being with us. Megasci is for you and for us.
Inside the heat becomes a pulse. I can feel the rush through every vein. Waiting for the break into the light. Everything is moving now, every wake is fast. I am more than this, higher than the skin, higher than the flow. Body meets the air becomes a wave that pulls us into something new. We are rising now we are the same. Everything is moving now, everything is fast. Everything is moving now, every wake is fast. I am more than this, higher than the skin, higher than the skin, higher than the skin, higher than the skin. Existence is a capacity, not a limit but a direction. Biological potential realized in the resonance of the self. Symbiose beyond the physical form. We are the current, the sum of every single breath.